John Romer Calloway had always known the vast, untamed expanse of the Montana Territory could claim a man, body, and soul, often without a whisper of warning. In the crisp autumn of 1878, with the towering peaks of the Bitterroot Mountains already hinting at the brutal, unforgiving winter to come, he was acutely, agonizingly aware of this truth. He crawled through the frozen, unforgiving dirt, his shredded left leg leaving a dark, crimson trail behind him that stained the fallen pine needles like spilled wine. The primal, guttural howl of the timber wolf, a sound that spoke of ancient hunger and merciless power, still echoed, vibrating deep within his bones. A chilling, persistent reminder of the brutal, one-sided encounter that had ultimately left him for dead among the ancient, silent pines. For nearly a decade, John had existed rather than lived, drifting aimlessly across this sprawling frontier, the war between the states. That crucible of fire and blood had carved an irreparable chasm in his very soul. He'd joined the Confederate ranks as little more than a boy, brimming with the fiery idealism of youth, only to watch that spirit slowly, brutally extinguished. He'd witnessed horrors that stained the landscape of his memory. Comrades fallen in senseless charges, friends wasting away from disease, a cause that ultimately crumbled to dust, leaving behind only ashes and bitter regret. When the last mournful shot was fired, he didn't look back. He simply walked away from to the smoking ruins of everything he had known, a lone, faceless figure, swallowed by the immense, indifferent vastness of the West. His family, scattered or lost to the conflict. His home, a distant, painful memory. His future, an empty canvas. He embraced the road, the anonymity, the constant movement. He became Roma, not just a nickname, but an identity, a shield against the settled life that promised only more pain, more attachment, more loss. The solitude, once a balm, had become a prison of his own making, a vast, empty space where the echoes of the past could reverberate unchecked. At 32, he had honed himself into a formidable, self-reliant shadow. He'd built a quiet reputation as a reliable trail hand, a man of few words who kept strictly to himself, spoke only when necessary, and worked with a tireless, almost inhuman resolve. He could outride, outshoot, and outlast most men in the wild. His senses sharpened by years of solitary survival. His eyes, though often distant, missed nothing, scanning every ridge, every shadow for the slightest hint of danger or opportunity. He knew the language of the wind, the whispers of the creek, the scent of rain long before the first drop fell. But none of that mattered now. All that raw strength, all that hard-won solitude, was steadily, relentlessly bleeding out onto the increasingly cold, unforgiving earth. The wound was deep, jagged, and searing with a pain that threatened to consume his very being. A fire in his flesh that mocked the freezing air. Every beat of his heart sent fresh waves of agony coursing through him, each pulse a drumbeat of approaching doom, pulling him closer to the precipice of oblivion. He fought to drag himself forward, each painful inch a desperate, grueling battle against the encroaching darkness. His consciousness, already frayed at the edges like an old, tattered map, was fading with every rasping, shallow breath, every agonizing pull of torn muscle. He could feel the cold seep into his bones, a chilling embrace that promised to lull him into an eternal slumber. The distant, mocking caw of a lone raven felt like a chilling eulogy already being sung, a prophet of the end that seemed so very near. His mind, slipping in and out of lucidity, clung to a single, desperate hope, the direction of the nearest homestead, a flicker of distant civilization, a faint promise of human warmth that might offer a chance, however slim, at survival. He pictured a glowing window, a wisp of smoke from a chimney, anything that hinted at life beyond the cold, indifferent wilderness. His vision blurred, the towering, majestic pine trees of the bitter root twisting into grotesque, abstract shadows against the bruised, fading twilight sky. The vibrant hues of autumn, once a source of fleeting beauty, now seemed to drain away, replaced by the encroaching gray and black of his impending end. The ground grew colder, solidifying beneath his weakening grasp, and a heavy, suffocating weariness began to settle over him, pulling him down, down, down into the eternal silence. He fought it, a guttural, animalistic growl escaping his parched throat, a last, defiant roar against the inevitable surrender that beckoned with insidious sweetness. He had faced death countless times on the battlefield, stared it down in the eyes of desperate men. But this was different. This was raw, untamed nature, indifferent and absolute, slowly reclaiming him, piece by agonizing piece. There would be no burial, no marker, just a silent absorption back into the earth from which he felt he had sprung. He was losing the fight. His limbs felt like lead. His breath came in ragged gasps, each one a struggle against the tightening vice of exhaustion. The world was narrowing to a pinpoint of searing pain and an overwhelming desire for oblivion. He closed his eyes, accepting the finality of it all, the cold embrace of the wilderness claiming another lost soul. The drifting had finally come to an end, a quiet, unremarked conclusion. Then a sound, a faint, almost imperceptible sound at first, cutting through the ringing in his ears, through the deafening throb of his wounds, through the rising tide of unconsciousness. The slow, rhythmic creak of wooden wagon wheels, distant at first, then growing steadily louder, distinct against the silence of the dying day. It was a sound so incongruous, so utterly out of place in the desolate, untamed wilderness where he lay, that for a moment John wondered if it was merely another cruel illusion conjured by his fevered, dying mind. Had the solitude finally broken him completely? Was this the final delusion before the long sleep? A comforting lie spun by a fading brain. But then, clearer, closer. A sharp, startled gasp, distinctly human, unmistakably feminine. It was a sound of alarm. Yes, a sudden realization of the brutal scene before them, of a man bleeding out in the fading light. But it was also, crucially, a sound of presence, of life, of a world still spinning beyond his pain and despair. "Good Lord in heaven," a woman's voice exclaimed, strong and clear, cutting through the thick, suffocating fog of pain and delirium that enveloped him like a shroud. The words, though undeniably laced with shock and horror, held an undeniable urgency, a spark of pure, unadulterated life that miraculously pierced his fading senses. "Hold on, mister, just hold on." The warmth of her voice was like a lifeline, pulling him back, if only for a moment, from the cold oblivion. That was the last thing John Romer Calloway remembered before the profound darkness finally, completely, consumed him, pulling him under into a cold, mercifully dreamless void. But this time, it was a darkness that held a new, fragile promise, a chance, however impossibly small, to awaken again, to feel the sun on his face, to breathe the crisp mountain air. It was a darkness not of finality, but of transition, a temporary slumber before an unknown dawn. The first thing John knew upon waking was fire, Not the searing primal burn of a wolf's teeth, nor the chilling cold of a Montana night, but a steady, persistent warmth that pulsed across his chest and arms, accompanied by the distinct, comforting smell of herbs and antiseptic. He tried to push himself up, a primal instinct to flee, asserting itself. But firm, gentle hands pressed him back down. "You'll tear those stitches if you move," a calm, measured voice stated, cutting through the haze of pain and medication. "That wolf nearly took your leg off, mister." John forced his eyelids open, blinking against the soft, filtered sunlight that streamed through homespun curtains. He found himself in a modest, immaculately kept cabin. Every surface gleamed. Every corner was swept. The air was thick with the scent of pine and something else, something clean and earthy, like freshly baked bread and dried lavender. A woman bent over him, her silhouette framed by the window's warm glow. She looked perhaps 25, with practical auburn hair tied back in a neat braid, and intelligent, observant green eyes that assessed him with a disarming, almost clinical precision. Her gaze was direct, unwavering, yet held a flicker of something akin to compassion. "My name is Clara Jensen," she said, her voice clear and unhurried as she wrung out a cloth in a basin beside his makeshift bed. "You're at my homestead, about 15 miles east of Fort Missoula. I found you half dead 3 days ago." 3 days John's throat was parched, his voice a raw croak. He felt a small sip of water touch his lips, cool and refreshing, a tiny oasis in his desert of pain. Clara nodded. "You've been fighting a fever. I wasn't sure you'd pull through." Her lips curved into a small, satisfied smile, a flash of quiet triumph. "But I've gotten rather good at proving doubts wrong." Over the next few days, John learned more about Clara. She was a widow, running her small ranch alone, save for occasional, infrequent help from a neighboring family whose spread was a good half-day's ride away. Her husband, Thomas, had succumbed to pneumonia 2 years prior, leaving her to manage everything herself: the small herd of cattle, the meager crops, the endless repairs, the relentless struggle against the unforgiving elements. She hadn't just survived, she had persevered, transforming her grief into an unwavering resolve that permeated every corner of her solitary life, shaping her into a woman of quiet, formidable strength. She learned medicine from her father, a doctor back east, Clara explained one evening, her voice devoid of self-pity, only a quiet pride in the knowledge. "He taught me everything he knew. Didn't think I'd ever truly need it out here. Not like this." It was that knowledge, painstakingly acquired in comfortable parlors and hushed sick rooms far removed from the rugged mountains of Montana, that had saved John's life. He looked at the neatly bandaged wounds, the slowly healing flesh, and the strong, capable hands that had so carefully sewn him back together. A profound, unfamiliar wave of gratitude washed over him, unsettling in its intensity. He hadn't felt indebted to anyone in years, preferring the clean, uncomplicated burden of self-reliance, of owing nothing to no one. But this was different. This was a debt of life, a responsibility he hadn't sought. "Why not go back east?" John asked one evening, nearly a week after she'd found him. He was sitting up now, though his body still ached with the memory of the wolf's brutal assault, and his leg, though steadily healing, was bound tightly, rendering him dependent. The cabin, warm with the aroma of savory stew, felt like a world away from the endless, dusty trails he'd known, a distant memory of a life of constant motion. Clara stirred the pot, her back to him, her shoulders a picture of quiet, unyielding determination. This is my land. Thomas and I built this place together. I'm not leaving it. Her words were simple, unwavering, yet they resonated with a deep, stubborn pride that John understood implicitly. He'd spent years running from his own past, from the ghosts of a war that refused to die, never staying anywhere long enough to put down even the shallowest of roots. He'd reveled in the perceived freedom of constant movement, convinced it was the only way to avoid the crushing weight of expectation, of disappointment, of loss. Something about Clara's quiet, unshakable determination, her fierce loyalty to a patch of hard-scrabble earth, made him feel a flicker of shame for his wandering, for his perpetual flight. She was building something real, tangible, while he had merely been existing. As May's hesitant warmth gave way to the full bloom of June, John's strength slowly, painstakingly returned. The deep gashes across his leg and shoulder healed to angry red lines, a permanent, vivid map of his near-death experience. But the phantom pain, though dulled, remained a constant, throbbing companion, a reminder of his vulnerability. He began to test his injured limb, pushing himself to do more around the homestead each morning. He fed the scrawny chickens, repaired fence posts that sagged from winter's abuse, chopped kindling with a renewed, if still somewhat clumsy, vigor. Each small task was a triumph, a reclaiming of his body and his will. Clara protested at first, her green eyes filled with a mixture of concern and a gentle stubbornness. "You don't owe me anything, Mr. Calloway," she had said one morning as he painstakingly saddled her horse for her daily check of the small, scattering herd of cattle grazing in the valley below. "John," he corrected, his voice still a little rough from disuse, a sound that felt foreign after so many years of silence. "And I know I don't, but I'm not ready to ride out yet." He didn't add the unspoken truth, the burgeoning thought that had begun to take root deep within him. A seedling of an idea that both thrilled and terrified him. He was beginning to wonder if he wanted to leave at all. The road, once his only companion, now felt cold and empty compared to the quiet warmth of Clara's home. Clara studied him for a long moment, her gaze unreadable, before a slow, almost imperceptible nod. "John." Then, "And you're welcome to stay until you're healed." It was an invitation, simple and understated, yet laden with a warmth he hadn't felt in years, a quiet acceptance he hadn't dared to dream of, a silent understanding that perhaps healed was a state of being, not just a physical condition. The days fell into a rhythm that John, to his own profound surprise, found unexpectedly comforting. Each evening, they shared meals at Clara's small, sturdy table, the simple fare made delicious by shared effort and quiet companionship. They talked well into the night, the flickering lamplight casting long, dancing shadows on the cabin walls, softening the edges of their guarded souls. John, usually so guarded, found himself opening up, slowly, haltingly. He spoke of his childhood in the rolling hills of Kentucky, of the brothers he'd lost to the war, of the Union soldiers whose faces still haunted his sleep, and the endless, aimless years of drifting afterward, trying to outrun the ghosts. He spoke of the bitter cold of winter on the high plains, the suffocating heat of summer in dusty cowtowns, the fleeting camaraderie of trail crews. He spoke of the loneliness, the gnawing emptiness that no amount of distance could truly fill, confessing it aloud for the first time. Clara, in turn, spoke of her childhood in bustling Boston, of her father's bustling medical practice, of learning to read and write and heal. She told him about her decision to marry Thomas and follow him west, leaving behind the comforts and certainties of the East to claim land under the Homestead Act. I was terrified, she admitted one night, her voice soft with memory, a rare glimpse into her own vulnerability. I'd never even camped outdoors before we set out. Robert thought I'd demand to go home within a month. But you didn't. John's voice was a quiet observation, a recognition of her inner fortitude. No. Her green eyes grew distant, gazing into the past. I discovered I was stronger than I knew. There's something about this land that demands everything from you, strips away all pretense and weakness, but it gives you back yourself, a truer, harder self. She looked at him then, her gaze piercing, as if inviting him to find that same truth within himself. John understood. The frontier had a brutal, yet strangely honest way of stripping away pretenses, leaving only what was true and essential. He'd never felt that more clearly than during these weeks of recovery. Watching Clara work from dawn until dusk, facing each challenge with a quiet, unyielding grace. She was a woman shaped by the harsh beauty of this land, tempered by loss, yet unbroken. Her quiet strength was a stark contrast to the chaotic, internal battles that still raged within him. Battles he'd tried to outrun, but had only succeeded in burying beneath layers of solitude. He found himself studying her, the way she moved with purpose, the way her brow furrowed in concentration when mending a saddle, the way her eyes softened when she spoke of her late husband's dream for the ranch. She was a beacon of groundedness, an anchor in a world he'd always tried to float through, rudderless and alone. The memory of the wolf attack, though still a vivid, painful scar on his mind, was slowly beginning to transform. It was no longer just a symbol of his vulnerability, of his fleeting existence, of the wildness that had nearly consumed him. It was the brutal catalyst that had brought him here, to this cabin, to Clara. And for the first time in years, the concept of a place to stay, to belong, didn't fill him with dread, but with a cautious, burgeoning hope. He had always believed freedom lay in endless movement, in the open road and the shifting horizon. But perhaps, just perhaps, true freedom was found in the courage to stand still, to build, to belong, to choose a life, rather than merely enduring one. This was a challenging thought for a man who had earned his nickname by perpetually moving. He still flinched at loud noises, still woke in a cold sweat from the nightmares of distant cannon fire and screaming men. But when the shadows of those memories pressed in, Clara's quiet presence, her steady breathing in the next room, became a subtle anchor, a reminder of the fragile, real world outside his head. He hadn't realized how deeply he had been craving such an anchor until he found himself clinging to it. The sheer quiet, the lack of the constant, underlying hum of anxiety that had defined his existence for so long, was a strange new sensation, almost overwhelming in its unfamiliarity. He was used to the fight, the flight. This peace felt fragile, too fragile to trust, perhaps. Yet, he found himself reaching for it, even in his sleep, a silent plea for it to remain. As summer ripened in the Bitterroot Valley, August brought not only the blazing heat of the high season, but also a deepening closeness between John and Clara. They moved through their days as a seamless unit, their work on the homestead a silent, practiced dance. John's strength had fully returned, his leg a testament to Clara's healing touch, now bearing only faint, silvery scars. He was no longer merely a helper, but a true partner, riding out with Clara to check on the cattle, mending miles of fence lines that stretched across their land, and even breaking ground for an expanded garden plot. His hands calloused and strong. Their conversations flowed easily, punctuated by comfortable silences that spoke volumes. They'd plan improvements to the chicken coop or discuss the rotation of crops under the vast, star-dusted Montana sky. The future unfolding before them in small, tangible dreams. Yet, this burgeoning peace, so fragile and hard-won, carried with it an undercurrent of unease, a shadow that stretched from John's tumultuous past. The nightmares had grown more frequent, more vivid, dragging him back to the fields of fire and screams. He'd wake in a cold sweat, his heart hammering against his ribs, the taste of dust and gunpowder still lingering in his throat. He'd relive moments of unimaginable terror, the charge into cannon fire, the desperate cries of men he couldn't save, the haunting stillness of the battlefield after the fighting ceased. These were not just bad dreams, they were visceral, unwelcome intrusions, a cruel reminder of the man he had been, the horrors he had witnessed, and the fundamental brokenness he carried within him. The terror wasn't just of the past, but of the present. He'd found a sanctuary, a reason to stop running. But the very act of settling, of investing his heart, brought with it a profound, paralyzing fear of loss. He knew, intimately, the pain of having everything stripped away. What if this peace, this burgeoning love, was just another fragile thing destined to shatter, leaving him even more broken than before? The thought of causing Clara pain, of inadvertently dragging her into the darkness that still clung to him, was unbearable. He wrestled with the insidious whisper that had always accompanied his deepest connections. Run, before it breaks, before you break her. He'd find himself standing by the cabin window late at night, staring out into the vast, silent darkness. The urge to simply saddle a horse and ride until the horizon swallowed him. A powerful, almost irresistible pull. His restless spirit, though quieted, was not entirely tamed. Clara, with her keen green eyes and quiet wisdom, saw the struggle. She rarely spoke of his restless nights, or the distant, haunted look that sometimes crossed his face during the day. Instead, she offered solace in action, a warm mug of coffee left silently by his side as he watched the sunrise, a hand placed gently on his arm during a shared meal, a quiet, understanding glance when he flinched at a sudden, loud noise. She didn't demand explanations or confessions. She simply was, a steady, unwavering presence, an anchor he hadn't known he desperately needed. Her unspoken support was a balm, but also a fresh source of his internal conflict. The deeper their bond grew, the heavier the weight of his past felt, the more he feared contaminating her bright, resilient spirit with his own shadows. Beyond John's internal battles, a more tangible threat began to emerge from the vast, untamed wilderness surrounding them. A series of small, unsettling incidents started to plague the homestead. A few head of cattle would go missing from the far pasture. Not enough to devastate their herd, but enough to raise a cold knot of dread in Clara's stomach. Fence lines would be cut, not cleanly, but with a deliberate, spiteful slash that spoke of human hands, not wandering animals. Tools left out would disappear, only to be found days later, broken or discarded. They found crude messages, warning signs carved into trees, telling them to leave. John, with his ingrained frontier caution, recognized the signs immediately. "We've got company," he stated one evening, his voice grim as he examined a freshly snapped fence post. "And they ain't friendly." Clara's jaw tightened. "Who would want to bother us out here? We don't have much that anyone would risk their neck for." Her voice held a hint of defiance, but also genuine confusion. John's gaze swept the darkening horizon. His eyes narrowed in thought. Some men just like to bother folks. Or maybe they think a widow out here alone is easy pickings. He didn't mention the other, more unsettling possibility that this might have something to do with his past. A lingering shadow from his drifting years finally catching up. He'd made enemies, crossed paths with rough men in dusty towns, tangled with outlaws and desperate souls who held on to grudges like grim keepsakes. The West was a big place, but grudges often traveled further than a man's reputation. A flicker of an old memory, of a small brutal skirmish over a card game in a forgotten saloon town, or a run-in with a desperate band of bushwhackers, would send a chill down his spine. Had one of them followed him? Or was it just the random, cruel hand of the untamed frontier, testing their resolve? The quiet acts of harassment escalated, becoming bolder, more aggressive. One night, a small hayrick near the barn caught fire, discovered just in time by Clara before it could spread, the embers glowing menacingly in the dark. Another day, they found a dead coyote, its throat slit, left conspicuously near the watering trough. A grotesque, silent message of intimidation. The air around the homestead grew thick with an unspoken tension, a suffocating sense of being watched. John and Clara found themselves instinctively taking turns standing watch at night, their sleep broken by every creak of the cabin, every rustle in the underbrush, their senses heightened to the point of exhaustion. The wild, untamed beauty of Montana, once a source of peace and endless horizons, now felt like a vast, isolating expanse, a place where danger could lurk just beyond the tree line, unseen, unheard, until it struck. This constant vigilance began to wear on them, fraying nerves already stretched thin by the daily demands of ranch life. Clara, ever resilient, found herself jumping at shadows, her usually steady hands trembling as she poured coffee each morning. The thought of being truly alone again, of losing the fragile partnership she'd built with John, became a terrifying prospect. She knew he carried burdens from his past, unseen scars that sometimes made his eyes distant and shadowed. But she had seen his goodness, his quiet strength, his unwavering loyalty. And for the first time in years, she felt a profound, exhilarating sense of shared purpose, of not being alone against the world. Losing that, losing him, felt like a deeper fear than any marauding wolf or desperate outlaw. One cool, crisp morning in late September, just as the aspens were turning to shimmering gold in the lower valleys, John rode out alone to check on a distant herd of their cattle. They'd noticed fresh tracks near the northern boundary, too large and deliberate for wild game, unmistakably human. He'd insisted Clara stay behind, a rare command in their partnership. His jaw set with a grim resolve, she recognized. The air was still, unnaturally so, the only sound the rhythmic crunch of his horse's hooves on the dry earth. He followed the tracks, a cold certainty settling in his gut, a premonition of the confrontation to come. This wasn't just mischief anymore. This was a direct challenge. He found them on the far side of their property, near a small, hidden spring, a secluded spot, perfect for an ambush. 3 men, rough-looking and heavily armed, were already rounding up a dozen of their best steers, prodding them towards the narrow paths that led out of the valley. A clear path for theft. One of them, a gaunt, scarred man with the missing tooth, looked up, his eyes meeting John's across the clearing. A slow, predatory grin spread across his face, a look of chilling recognition. "Well, well, well," the scarred man called, his voice raspy, oozing with false familiarity. "Look what the cat dragged in. Romer Calloway. Heard you settled down, pretty boy, with a widow, no less. Guess the road finally broke you. A jolt of ice shot through John's veins, colder than any Montana winter, colder than the wolf's fangs. This wasn't random. This was personal. He remembered the man, now Jedediah Stone, a ruthless opportunist from a brutal gang he'd briefly crossed paths with years ago. A run-in that had ended with Stone getting a broken arm and a lifetime of festering resentment. The past, it seemed, had finally caught up, not as a whisper in a dream, but as a living, breathing threat. "Those are my cattle," John stated, his voice low, deceptively calm. A dangerous tremor beneath the surface. His hand instinctively went to the Colt holstered at his hip. Its familiar weight, a cold, reassuring comfort against his thigh. Stone chuckled, a harsh, grating sound, his eyes glinting with malicious amusement. "Your cattle. Funny. Looked like stray cattle to us. And a pretty little ranch for the taking." He gestured with his rifle towards the distant homestead. A slow, sickening sweep that encompassed Clara's cabin. "Maybe we'll pay your lady friend a visit. See if she's as welcoming as you are." That was the line, the casual threat, the insidious insinuation aimed at Clara. Ignited a furious, protective fire in John that burned away all the fear, all the self-doubt, all the lingering echoes of the past decade of running. This wasn't about his past anymore. This was about their future. This was about his home. This was about Clara. The air crackled with a dangerous stillness, the silence of the wilderness holding its breath, waiting. John knew, with absolute certainty, that this was the moment. The calm had shattered. The test had begun. He was no longer running from anything. He was fighting for everything. The casual threat, the insidious insinuation aimed at Clara, had ignited a furious, protective fire in John. It burned away the last vestiges of his fear, the lingering self-doubt, and the decade of instinct that had urged him to run. This wasn't about his past anymore. It was about their future, about his home, about Clara. The air crackled with a dangerous stillness, the silence of the wilderness holding its breath. John knew, with absolute certainty, that this was the moment. The calm had shattered. The test had begun. He was no longer running from anything. He was fighting for everything. Jedediah Stone, with his missing tooth and predatory grin, was a ghost from a past John had tried to outrun. But now, that ghost was threatening the very sanctuary John had found. "Those are my cattle," John repeated, his voice dangerously low, deceptively calm, the words cutting through the crisp mountain air like a blade. His hand, as if guided by an ancient instinct, went to the Colt holstered at his hip, its familiar weight a cold, reassuring comfort against his thigh. Stone's chuckle was a harsh, grating sound, laced with arrogance. "Your cattle, funny, looked like stray cattle to us, and a pretty little ranch for the taking." His rifle gestured carelessly towards the distant homestead, a silent, sickening promise of violence. "Maybe we'll pay your lady friend a visit. See if she's as welcoming as you are." John's mind sharpened, his senses honing in on the three men. 3-1. Not ideal, but not insurmountable for a man who had faced worse odds on battlefields stained with blood. He analyzed their positions, their weapons, their attitudes. Stone, the arrogant leader, a younger, nervous man, and a hulking, silent brute. The sun was at his back, a slight advantage, but the terrain was open. offering little cover. He needed to draw them into a more confined space, a place where his knowledge of the land, his honed instincts, could give him an edge. "Get off my land," John ordered, his voice now devoid of any pretense of calm, infused with the steel of a man pushed to his breaking point. Stone's grin widened. "Humorless. Or what? Roma, you gonna pull that fancy iron? You ain't got the stomach for it anymore. Heard you went soft." The insult, calculated to provoke, hit its mark. But it wasn't anger that filled John. It was a cold, pure resolve. He wasn't soft. He was simply fighting for something real, something worth preserving. With a movement as swift as a striking viper, John drew his Colt. The sharp crack echoed through the valley as the first shot tore through the air, hitting the ground inches from Stone's boot. It was a warning, a declaration, not a miss, but a statement. "I am here, and I will fight." The element of surprise, however brief, was his. Stone's men flinched, startled by the sudden aggression from the man they believed was soft. John didn't wait. He immediately ducked behind a gnarled juniper bush, reloading with practiced ease. His movements fluid despite the lingering ache in his leg. Bullets whizzed past, kicking up dust and splinters from the branches around him. The air filled with the acrid scent of gunpowder. This was the battlefield again. But this time, he was fighting for a different banner. Not the stars and bars, but the simple, unadorned flag of home. He needed to draw them away from the cattle, away from any line that might lead them closer to Clara. He moved strategically, using the sparse terrain to his advantage, drawing fire, always moving, a phantom in the sparse cover. He picked off the hulking brute first, a clean shot to the shoulder that sent him sprawling with a bellow of pain. One down. The nervous man panicked, firing wildly, his shots going wide. Stone, however, was cunning. He circled, trying to flank John, his movements precise and deadly. The gunfight became a desperate dance, each man trying to outwit the other. John felt a searing pain rip through his side, a grunt escaping his lips as he stumbled, hitting the ground hard. Stone's shot. He gritted his teeth, pressing a hand to the fresh wound, the warmth of his own blood blooming against his fingers. It wasn't deep, he realized. A glancing blow, but it stung like hell and reminded him of his vulnerability. The fear, for a fleeting moment, threatened to resurface. The cold, familiar dread of dying alone, wounded in the wilderness. But then Clara's face flashed in his mind, her steady green eyes, her quiet strength. He wouldn't let them reach her. He wouldn't let them destroy what they had built. He leveraged his position, using the pain as fuel. He fired 2 rapid shots, forcing Stone and the remaining henchmen to take cover behind a cluster of boulders. John knew he couldn't sustain a prolonged engagement. He was wounded, outnumbered, and time was running out. He needed a decisive move. He remembered Clara's words, her lessons on the land. He scanned the rocky outcrop behind Stone, a narrow, unstable ridge, a dangerous idea, but potentially decisive. He yelled, a guttural war cry that hadn't left his lips since the war, designed to disorient, to draw their attention. As Stone and his accomplice hesitated, momentarily distracted, John seized the chance. He fired a series of suppressive shots, forcing them to keep their heads down. Then, with a burst of adrenaline-fueled speed, he bolted, not towards them, but around the cluster of boulders, scrambling up the loose scree of the ridge behind them. It was a reckless, desperate gamble. Stones tumbled beneath his boots, threatening to send him hurtling down. He could hear Stone yelling, realizing his maneuver. Just as he reached the top, getting a clear view, a shot rang out from below, tearing into his already injured leg, forcing a choked cry from his lips. He faltered, his vision tunneling, but he pressed on, ignoring the fresh agony. With a supreme effort, he dislodged a massive, precariously balanced boulder. With a primal shove, he sent it crashing down the slope. The roar of the tumbling rock was deafening, a thunderous rumble that echoed through the valley. Stone and his man looked up, their faces etched with terror. They scrambled, but it was too late. The boulder smashed into the cluster of rocks where they had been taking cover, sending shrapnel and smaller rocks flying. A sickening crunch, a muffled scream, and then silence. When the dust settled, only scattered debris remained. John stood, panting, bleeding, leaning heavily against the ridge, the familiar metallic taste of blood in his mouth. He had done it. He had faced them, and he had won. His victory, however, was costly. The second wound in his leg, though not as deep as the initial wolf attack, was debilitating. He staggered down the ridge, his vision swimming, the world tilting precariously. The adrenaline was fading, replaced by a wave of crushing weakness. He managed to retrieve his horse, a long, agonizing process, and slowly, painstakingly, mounted. The ride back to the homestead was a blur of pain, consciousness fading in and out like a dying lantern. He clutched the saddle horn, his body swaying, his mind clinging to a single image, Clara's face. He had to get back to her. He had to tell her they were safe. Darkness had fallen by the time his horse, sensing its destination, stumbled into the yard. John swayed precariously in the saddle, his head lolling. He heard the sudden burst of light from the cabin as Clara, alerted by the horse, threw open the door. Her gasp, this time, was one of pure, unadulterated terror. John. Her voice was a sharp cry, instantly by his side, her strong hands steadying him as he slid from the saddle. He collapsed into her arms, the familiar scent of pine and herbs, of her, filling his nostrils. It's done, he rasped, his voice barely a whisper, blood seeping from his side and leg. He could feel himself slipping away, the darkness beckoning once more. Clara, her face pale with shock but her eyes blazing with determination, immediately took charge. Her medical training, learned in the comfortable drawing rooms of Boston, now sprang to life with primal urgency in the harsh Montana night. She dragged him, with surprising strength, into the cabin, stripping away his blood-soaked clothes, her fingers moving with swift, practiced precision as she assessed the wounds. The bullet had passed clean through his side, luckily missing any vital organs, but the leg wound was nasty, closer to the bone than she liked. She cleaned them meticulously, the smell of disinfectant filling the small cabin, her brow furrowed in concentration as she worked by lamplight. John drifted in and out of consciousness, dimly aware of her focused movements, the gentle but firm touch of her hands. Hours later, the worst was over. The wounds were cleaned, stitched, and bandaged. Clara sat by his makeshift bed, her hair disheveled, her face smudged with dirt and worry. But her green eyes, though tired, were clear and resolute. John, propped up against a pile of blankets, felt a profound sense of peace settle over him, unlike anything he'd ever known. He was wounded. Yes, but he was alive. And he was here. He looked at Clara, at the woman who had saved him not once, but twice, who had fought his battles, external and internal, with a quiet fierceness that humbled him. The terror of the past, the gnawing fear of attachment, the instinct to flee, they had all been burned away in the fire of that confrontation. He had faced his demons, both outside and within, and for the first time, he hadn't run. He had stood his ground. He had fought, and he had fought for her, for them. He saw her then, not just as his rescuer, not just as his partner, but as his destiny. "Clara," he whispered, his voice raspy but clear. He reached out a trembling hand, and she took it, her calloused fingers intertwining with his. Her eyes, weary but steady, met his. "Rest. John, you've had a long day." "No." He shook his head weakly. I can't. Not yet." He took a deep, shuddering breath, the words forming, clear and undeniable, in his mind. The thought was no longer terrifying, but exhilarating. This wasn't about obligation or survival. This was about choice. "I have nothing to offer you," he began, the familiar words from their earlier conversation echoing in his ears. But this time, they felt different. They were a raw, honest confession, stripped bare of all pretense. "No land of my own, no money saved, no promises I know I can keep, not after. All this," he gestured vaguely to his scarred body, to the lingering ghosts. Clara's gaze softened, her grip on his hand firm. "I'm not asking for any of those things." "John," she replied, her voice gentle but unwavering. "Just your honesty, and perhaps your company through the winter, to start." She had said those words months ago, and they had been a lifeline. Now, they were a promise. John's eyes, wide with a newfound clarity, searched hers. The terror of his past, the gnawing fear of attachment, the instinct to flee, they had all been burned away in the crucible of that day. He had faced his demons, both outside and within, and for the first time, he hadn't run. He had stood his ground. He had fought, and he had fought for her, for them. He saw her then, not just as his rescuer, not just as his partner, but as his destiny. A weight lifted from him, a burden he hadn't realized he'd been carrying for a decade. He was free, truly free, for the first time in his life, not from responsibility, but from the endless, aimless wandering. "That I can give." "Clara," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion, his eyes shining. "More than that, if you'll have it." He tightened his grip on her hand, pulling her gently closer, the pain in his leg momentarily forgotten. "Clara Jensen," he said, the name a sweet melody on his tongue. "Will you marry me?" Her smile bloomed slowly, like a sunrise breaking over the Montana mountains, dispelling the last shadows of doubt. Her eyes, glistening with unshed tears, were steady and bright as she looked at him, at the scarred, weary man who had found his way back to life in her care. "Yes, John Calloway," she murmured, her voice soft but resolute. "I will." Their first kiss was tentative, a question asked and answered in the glow of the flickering lamplight. A silent promise exchanged between two souls who had found sanctuary and purpose in each other's presence. When they parted, Clara's smile held a mixture of wonder and caution that perfectly reflected John's own feelings. They had time, he realized. For once in his life, he wasn't in a hurry to move on. The battle was won, but the journey had just begun. He had found his true north, and it was here, with her. The flickering lamplight cast long dancing shadows across Clara's cabin walls, illuminating the quiet understanding that now settled between John and Clara. The battle with Jedediah Stone's men had forged an unbreakable bond. John's wounds, though still painful, were healing under Clara's meticulous care, a testament not just to her skill, but to his own newfound will to live, to stay, to build. He was no longer just a survivor. He was a man with a purpose, with a place, and with a woman whose hand in his felt like destiny itself. Their days immediately following the confrontation were a delicate balance of recovery and resilience. While John slowly regained his strength, Clara attended to his injuries, her focus unwavering. He watched her move, swift and purposeful, a quiet strength emanating from her every action. He saw the tired lines around her eyes, and his heart ached with a tenderness he hadn't known he was capable of. The physical wounds would heal, but the deeper healing, the mending of John's fractured spirit had already begun. He was a man reborn, not from the ashes of battle, but from the fertile ground of Clara's fierce independence and unwavering kindness. The nightmares still occasionally visited, specters of cannon fire and dying men. But now, a subtle shift occurred. He would wake, heart hammering, but Clara's steady presence beside him became an instant anchor. He no longer felt the desperate urge to flee, to outrun the memories. Instead, he would turn to her, letting her warmth seep into him, a silent reassurance that the past, though it haunted, no longer defined his present. He had faced his demons on that ridge, and while they hadn't vanished entirely, they no longer held him captive. He was truly free, anchored by his choice. As John regained full strength, his focus sharpened on the homestead. It was no longer Clara's ranch. It was their home, their future. He threw himself into the work with a passion he hadn't felt since before the war. He spent weeks repairing the ravaged fence lines, stronger and more meticulously than before, envisioning them as invisible walls protecting his newfound sanctuary. He worked tirelessly to expand their garden, turning the rich Montana soil, dreaming of bountiful harvests. He built a larger, more secure chicken coop, a new storage shed. His hands, once accustomed to clutching a rifle, now shaping timber with purpose and care. Every swing of the hammer, every nail driven home, was an affirmation of his commitment to stay, to build, to belong. His innate understanding of horses, honed over years of riding, quickly became apparent. There was a young, unbroken colt on a neighboring ranch, notorious for throwing every rider. John, seeing a reflection of his own untamed spirit in the colt's wild eyes, quietly approached old Silas McGregor. For weeks, John worked patiently, coaxing the colt, understanding its fears, earning its trust. It was a patient, arduous process, a mirror of his own journey from wildness to acceptance. When he finally rode the colt, Silas watched in awe. News of John Calloway's skill spread quickly through the valley, establishing his reputation. Neighbors began seeking his advice, creating an unexpected stream of income and a sense of belonging within the community. Their wedding was a quiet affair in Clara's sun-drenched cabin. Just as the aspens turned gold, the local circuit preacher performed the vows, with old Silas and his wife, Martha, as the only guests. No grand celebrations, just solemn promises. John looked at Clara, radiant in her sewn dress, and knew this was his true home. The years of drifting had ended. He had found his anchor. Their first kiss as husband and wife was a promise whispered on the wind. The autumn days were filled with contentment. They worked side by side, preparing for winter. They harvested the garden, Clara preserving. John reinforced the barn, split firewood, and sealed the cabin walls. Each evening, they sat by the fire, planning for spring, hands intertwined. John had never known such peace, such deep joy. The ache in his heart was filling with love, purpose, and the burgeoning dream of a family. Then, one brisk evening in late October, as the first snow dusted distant peaks, Clara turned to him, her hand gently on her stomach. "John," she began, I have something to tell you." A tremor went through him. "We're going to have a baby," she whispered. "It'll be due late next autumn." A baby. Their baby. The news hit John like a wave. Pure joy met with profound terror. He, the man who had abandoned everything, was now creating new life. His hand instinctively went to the slight swell of her stomach, a gesture of awe and protectiveness. Clara watched his face. "Are you happy?" she asked. They stood in the newly plowed field a few days later. John turned, placing his hand firmly over hers. The terror was overshadowed by a joy so vast he struggled to articulate it. "More than I have words for," he said, and terrified in equal measure. Clara laughed. "Good. That means you understand what we're undertaking. John Calloway, it means you're ready." Her unwavering faith humbled him. He was ready to be a husband, a rancher, a father, to build, to stay. The vast Montana sky promised a future as boundless as the horizon. Clara Jensen had always believed in resilience and in the rich tapestry their lives would weave. Their world, once defined by solitary survival, blossomed into a vibrant testament to shared dreams. In October of 1879, Victoria Calloway, their daughter, came into the world. Her cries were the sweetest sound John had ever heard. John felt the last pieces of his old restlessness fall away. "Hello, Victoria," he whispered. "Your mama and I have been waiting for you." The years brought profound changes to the Calloway Jensen homestead. John's skill with horses brought steady income and expanded their land. Clara's garden blossomed into an orchard, and her herbal knowledge made her the valley's unofficial healer. Victoria grew into a spirited child, with her father's dark hair and mother's determined nature, showing a natural affinity for horses. In 1885, Arthur Calloway was born, completing their circle. Arthur, quieter, showed his mother's gift for healing. John, now respected as a rancher and horseman, often marveled at his transformation. The drifter, who once measured worth by distance, now measured it in cultivated acres. Children raised, and years loving one extraordinary woman. His scars no longer defined him. They were part of his story, leading him home. On the 10th anniversary of the wolf attack, John and Clara rode into the Bitterroot Mountains. They made camp near where John had nearly died, now a place of profound beauty. Under blazing stars, John held Clara close. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked. taking in a half-dead stranger who upended your carefully ordered life. Clara laughed. Not for a single moment. John Calloway, you didn't upend my life. You completed it. She teased. Even when you track mud into my clean kitchen, or stubbornly disagree about that new colt, especially then. She softened. Love isn't about perfection, my dear. It's about finding someone whose flaws fit with yours. Someone who makes the hard journey worth taking. John kissed her. I love you, Clara Calloway. More today than yesterday, and less than tomorrow. They made love beneath the Montana sky, their passion undiminished. Afterward, as Clara slept, John watched the stars. The wolf that had nearly killed him had instead driven him toward life, love, family, and purpose. His terrible wounds, now silver scars, led to a healing deeper than skin and bone. John Calloway, once without roots, found his true north in the arms of a woman brave enough to build a life in the wilderness. Together, they created something that would outlast them, a legacy of love, hard work, and fierce resilience. As dawn broke, John woke Clara. Time to head home, he said. The children will be waiting. Home, she echoed. Hand in hand. They walked to their horses, ready to return to the life they'd built, a life neither could have imagined before fate. And a timber wolf intervened. In 1908, 30 years after a wounded man crawled from the mountains into a widow's care, John and Clara sat on their porch, watching the sunset paint the sky crimson. We've had a good life, Clara, John said, his hair now silver, his hand still firmly holding hers. The best, she agreed. And there's still more to come. John smiled. Their story, begun in blood and pain, had blossomed into something beautiful and enduring. I'm glad that wolf didn't finish me off. He chuckled. Clara squeezed his hand. So am I, my love. So am I. As darkness settled over the ranch they had built, John Calloway gazed at the woman who had saved him in every way that mattered. In her eyes, he still saw the determined young widow who had tended his wounds and shown him a path to love. A path he continued to walk with gratitude and joy, one day at a time, right there, at home,